Okay, welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center, the nation's living memorial to its 28th president. For today's presentation, Young and Undocumented, the New American Story. And more on that in just a moment. First, some business. My name is John Molesky, and my full-time job here is I'm an executive producer, managing editor, and host of our weekly television radio program, Dialogue at the Wilson Center. I'm curious, how many of you are visiting the Wilson Center for the first time? Okay, a significant amount of you. And so those of you visiting us for the first time, welcome. Those of you who are returnees, welcome back. Also want to welcome those of you watching online via the webcast and those of you watching our broadcast on MHZ Worldview channel. And for those of you who are first-timers, it gives me an excuse to provide a bit of a Wilson Center description or plug. We conduct deep research here. We also facilitate civil discourse with emphasis on the civil. As you know, these are harshly partisan times in this town, and there aren't many places where you can come together and have a civil and intelligent discussion on important issues that can be challenging and bring passion. And that's what we try to do here, and we hope that you'll join us in doing that today. In that regard, today's session could not be more timely. We want to inform the public policy process, and as you know, the nation is in the midst of deciding upon how it will move forward on massive immigration reform. What we hope will be substantial immigration reform, I should say, and not incremental. And so this is an opportunity today, we hope, to inform that discussion. And inform it from a different perspective, from a highly personal perspective. This is a good reminder that all public policy eventually is a human decision that affects lives. And so we're going to have the privilege today of hearing the stories of three students who are undocumented as an official classification attending Georgetown University. And this will give us another look at what can sometimes be an impersonal public policy debate. I want to tell you that today's session is jointly sponsored by the Wilson Center and Georgetown University, so we want to thank our partners in this presentation. It's also co-hosted by the Center's Latin American program, the Mexico Institute, in cooperation with our Africa program. There are many people we could thank individually, but we'll only thank one since I'm fairly certain you're not here to hear us thank ourselves. But I do want to recognize Susan Theriault, a professor of anthropology at Georgetown, who also happens to be a Wilson Center fellow. And Susan, if you would please stand and be recognized. Susan organized this, and it's going to be a terrific event. Thanks, Susan. And now on to the main event. The undergraduates that are sitting before you are members of an organization called Hoyas for Immigrant Rights. It's a student advocacy organization at the university. Each is going to share with you their stories and their ideas for 15 minutes each, and then we'll come back to these chairs and respond to your questions. So we're going to do this for reasons of privacy with first name introductions only. So Francisco, who hails from Mexico originally, is going to be our first presenter. Francisco.
Right, since I will be speaking for 15 minutes, I'll probably take some of my water.
Why don't you take it with you? There's a coaster over there.
Actually, I plan to keep this very, very short. First of all, we are honored to speak before you and take part in moving forward with comprehensive immigration reform. We can't express how grateful we are with the Woodrow Wilson Center for not only organizing this event, but truly believing in the power of our stories. We want to, of course, thank Georgetown University for being welcoming of all students and supporting our work. And finally, we want to thank our team, Hoyas for Immigrant Rights, a student-led group at Georgetown University serving the immigrant community. This event wouldn't be possible without our members and allies. And I have to signal them out because they're back there. But thank you guys for also believing in the power of our stories. Now, I wish that I could easily share my name with you, but even in college, I struggled between Francisco Gutierrez, which is probably what my parents intended, and Francisco Gutierrez, which is what I normally share with my friends and peers. And I must confess that I do get some glares from Latin Americans who suppose that I'm just being pretentious. But regardless, today is a great day to talk. Today is a great day to share the new American story, as the title of the event sets forth. And I would have never imagined talking to an audience like you. In fact, I would have never imagined sharing my story, the undocumented experience. I like to think that my story is a bit more romantic than most stories. My father and mother met in the Mexican Navy and married the following year. Despite never finishing school, they began constructing their lives as merchants, teachers, and community service providers. They never intended migrating to the U.S. In fact, they built a home and gave birth to my beautiful sister. 9 years later, my mother gave birth to me, which she thought was a miracle, given that the doctor told her that she would never again procreate. And that's really when times became difficult. My parents were market vendors, and they had set up 2 stalls in the market, but business slowly subsided. And without much left to do, they sought a place where their children wouldn't bear the economic instability of the country, where their children would pursue higher education. And they were set for the land of opportunity, and without very much money, they crossed the border, and we've established our lives in New York, and we have lived there ever since. Now, the reason I share the story is because without my parents, I wouldn't be here. In fact, we wouldn't be having this conversation. Now, the title of the event, again, is Young and Undocumented, the New American Story. It's clear that I'm young and undocumented, but we often forget that the New American Story is not just about me or my fellow classmates, but rather about the families and homes we've established, about our daily interactions in our immigrant communities, and the interconnected stories between all of us. That's what I imagine the New American Story to be. But sadly, we get lost in a game of scapegoating, and soon our parents are at fault for bringing us to this country without our consent, for bringing us to this country without asking us. And I think that's silly. I mean, do Catholics ask their children if they can baptize them at such a young age? Do mothers ask their daughters if they can pierce their ears at age 1 or circumcise their sons at birth? The idea is that our parents thought that they were doing what was best for us. And I can't imagine a parent who decides to make his son's lives miserable. In fact, the last thing my parents wanted was to distance themselves from their 2-year-old. Our parents are an integral part of our lives, and this is why they too deserve a reasonable and fair path to citizenship. Now, being young also means exploring oneself. As undocumented, you don't have the privilege of spending too much time doing it, but you are more conscious about your identity. Just last year, I came out again. This time, I came out gay to my parents, and, well, they weren't too happy about it. In fact, they were in denial and are still struggling with the idea of it. But the reality is that a lot of young and undocumented people are also part of the LGBTQ community, and this is also part of the New American Story. Every day we hear about gay couples being torn apart by outdated enforcement policies. We hear about lesbians who adopt children, but because one mother is not biologically tied to the child, she is no longer a family member. And of course, some states don't even allow for gay marriage. I am troubled by current immigration policy proposals that fail to address these injustices. However, I do applaud the president for proposing a provision that would allow a U.S. citizen or permanent resident to seek the ability to seek a visa for his or her spouse of the same sex. Now, these types of measurements are what truly allow for a true comprehensive reform. Now, like I said, I said I was going to keep it short, so I have one final story to share. Last year, I traveled west for the first time and visited my sister, whom I had not seen in over 14 years. It was a weird, but very pleasant and long-needed encounter. We spent the month and a half together, and as she recovered from her gallbladder surgery, I took care of my niece, and I spent life as an uncle. However, I soon discovered how difficult my sister's life was in California. Afraid of driving without a license, but having no other alternative, waiting in long lines at welfare centers to simply feed her daughter, and worse, having to say goodbye to a special friend who was deported. Despite being of age, my sister doesn't qualify for the DREAM Act or has any other option of obtaining residency, of course, with the exception of waiting maybe 19 years until her daughter can petition for her. She was lucky to find employment now, but I can guarantee that she will continue to endure other hardships if she remains undocumented. The worst I fear is that my sister gets deported for, let's say, driving without a license and has to live apart from her daughter. As you can tell, the overarching theme is family unity. And contrary to mainstream voices, the young and undocumented, which include us three, or us two, and the rest of the 2 million young immigrants, we cannot envision their lives without their parents, their partners and spouses, their children, their friends and loved ones. The reality is that I am more than just a dreamer. I am a friend, companion, brother, son, you name it. And as much as I want to cater to a certain group, an exceptional group as many perceive us to be part of, I will continue to advocate for the entire immigrant community. Because the reality is that I am not an exception, but rather an example of what the immigrant community can offer. We want a representative legislation bill, which means, yes, a direct path to citizenship for dreamers, but also a reasonable and fair path for everyone else. I will end my talk by sharing one of my biggest personal concerns. I'm graduating this May from Georgetown University. My parents have never visited, not even during Parents' Weekend. They have always been afraid of driving down. They imagine that they will be stopped in the middle of the road and possibly deported. We're talking about driving down from New York City that is only 4 hours away. Unlike me, my parents live in constant fear. And my heart breaks at the thought that they will not be here to celebrate my 4 years of hard work. Let's pass a reform. Together, we can do it.
Thank you, Francisco. Next, you're going to hear from Kim, whose family hails from Kenya. Kim, come on up.
Good evening. I actually spoke to my dad right before giving this speech, and he told me, "You go, girl." So I'll do that, Dad. He's watching right now. So my name is Kim. I was born in Germany. I came to the United States when I was 2 years old. My family is originally from Kenya. I have been undocumented in this country for nearly 18 years. Growing up, I didn't know about my immigration status, but I was very aware of the consequences of my parents' choice. I grew up in a working poor family. My parents struggled, working paycheck to paycheck to raise a family of 4 on about $20,000 per year. Without access to welfare or food stamps. They relied mainly on Catholic charities, and some of my fondest memories in my childhood are actually of the food pantries in churches where my mom would do most of our grocery shopping. My parents actually applied for driver's licenses, and they acquired them legally under state law and began to search for work when they came to the States to support our family. They worked sometimes 2 jobs, and although they had university degrees in the country, in their country of origin, and were obviously overqualified for many of the positions they worked in, they saw this as a sacrifice and an opportunity to provide for their children and to give them the opportunities that they never would have had. Despite their financial hardships, my parents went to school. They paid out of pocket for their school fees. Oftentimes, they were required to pay international fees because of their status. Eventually, my father made the ultimate sacrifice, his education, so that my mother could pursue higher education. And I'm happy to say that this past December, I was able to attend her graduation. My mother received her PhD. So, they struggled many years to pay for their education and to pay for me to go to school and to support me and my brother. I think it's very important for me to emphasize, because I think that this is a common misconception. My parents did not come here to live illegally. They were not waiting for an amnesty bill. They actually came here on a traveler's visa, and they were told by other immigrants in the community that there was the possibility of filing for a change of status through employers. So they came knowing that there were possibilities for them to change their status and become legal in this country. And so within a few years, they asked various employers to file for them, and many of them were reluctant to do so because they felt that the paperwork was just too difficult, or they simply didn't know much about the process. And so my parents looked for other avenues to gain a legal status. They thought about applying for student visas, but that was also not practical for them because with a growing family, they were not able to go to school full-time, pay school fees, and support their children. And so in 2001, my parents filed for 245I. And this was kind of their last chance to gain legal status. My dad found an employer that was willing to file for him. They worked with a lawyer to send in an application, which they successfully did. They met the deadline, they had everything together. But after September 11th of 2001, a lot of the rhetoric about immigration changed dramatically. And my parents contacted their lawyer at the time, who said that he wasn't able to track down their application to find out where they were in terms of the process. And they were very reluctant to continue to pursue finding out where their application was, just because people were so suspicious of anyone who had filed for a change of status within that time. So they kind of let it go, and were very patient. It was not until last year, 11 years after they filed for a change of status, that they actually tried to, after trying to contact their lawyers for many, many years, that they tried one last time to contact a lawyer and to find out the status of their application. So the lawyer sent letters to the Department of Labor, to INS, waiting 3 months at a time for each of these departments to respond, and they had no idea where my parents' application was. So then they asked their lawyer, who should have record of the applications that they have processed, and their lawyer said that he had been robbed several years before, which he had never informed us, and all his records had been lost, including my parents' application or any proof that any application had been filed. So I guess this just shows that, my parents were willing to do things somewhat the right way, and the system just didn't work for them. And this was one of the latest closed doors in my parents' pursuit of legal status. Of course, I grew up unaware of all of this. In spite of my family's circumstances, I had a loving and happy childhood. My parents made me feel as though I was no different from any other kid. They raised me as an American. They raised me to love this country and to believe in the promises of this country and the rights and privileges that this country has, that they applied to me just as much as anyone else. They encouraged me to pursue my dreams, no matter how impractical they may have seemed, and they encouraged me to sing and to dance, and they really fostered my love of performance. My father would often say, and he still says it to this day, to shoot for the moon, and if you don't make it, at least you'll land among the stars. They made me believe that anything was possible if I put my mind to it, and this applied to education as well. From as early as I could remember, I knew that I was going to go to college because my parents made me believe that it was possible for me. When I was 17 years old, I started filling out my college applications. And one evening, my parents called me to the dining room table and told me that there was something that they never wanted me to find out, and they hoped that it would have changed by the time that I was 17, but that I was undocumented. And my initial response was relief in a way, because I came to understand why my parents' lives had been so difficult in this country. I understood, why I wasn't able to get a driver's license when everyone else was. But I also became very angry and confused because I realized that so many opportunities would be closed for me in the future. And I really started to think about, what does the future hold for a young person like me who doesn't have papers? But I was determined to not be a victim of my circumstances and to pursue my dream of going to a good college. My family drove for 22 hours, about 1,550 miles to DC to drop me off for my first year at Georgetown University. I will never forget when they left. Thank you. I will never forget when they left me on campus, because it was the first time that being undocumented became a reality for me. I had no idea when I would ever see my family again, because at that time I did not know if I could attempt to fly home by plane without the risk of deportation. And despite being indefinitely separated from my family, I began my time at Georgetown determined to make the most of this experience. However, I faced many obstacles. The greatest obstacle was definitely financial. Because I'm undocumented, I don't receive a penny of federal aid. I cannot apply for Pell Grants or student loans to cover my tuition. And ironically, my picture is actually on the FAFSA website, the Federal Student Aid website. My parents have to pay my tuition out of pocket, and they've spent their savings in order for me to stay at Georgetown. Recently, they were forced to sell my childhood home so that I can stay at Georgetown. And as of now, I don't know how I will be able to afford to continue to attend Georgetown next semester. I recently was approved for deferred action for childhood arrivals, which I am truly grateful. But before this, and even with this approval, I am still financially dependent on my parents. This makes it quite difficult to participate in, regular social activities like going to clubs or restaurants. And most importantly, it makes it very difficult to be a productive student. Because I often can't afford school supplies and textbooks, I have had to borrow most of my books and explain to professors that I simply can't afford to purchase a textbook. However, with DACA, I have had many opportunities. Recently, I began my first job, or I began to search for a job, and I also began my first job. But in the job search, I also faced many challenges. I've had employers or potential employers tell me that my situation seems very suspicious. They don't understand, and I also find it very difficult to explain that I'm lawfully present in the United States and that I have a work permit but no immigration status. I'm truly grateful for the opportunity to work part-time, but even with a job, I can't afford to be at Georgetown. In school, it is difficult to talk about future plans. Georgetown is an incredible university with very determined students, and they're always talking about the future and internships and different opportunities they're involved in. I am a student in the School of Foreign Service, and I'm studying French as a part of my degree. Studying abroad is a chance to gain proficiency in a foreign language and to experience another culture. It is an expected part of being in the School of Foreign Service at my school. Before June 15th of 2012, studying abroad was a topic that I could only dream of, and an uncomfortable topic that I generally avoided talking about. Now my hope is that through DACA and through advanced parole, that I will be able to fulfill my childhood dream of learning French, of going abroad and having that full experience. These are the obstacles I face pretty much in my everyday life, but this is only a glimpse into my story, and it's really only a glimpse into the undocumented immigrant experience in this country. Obviously, there are some things that I cannot share with you, and there are other things that are just too emotionally difficult to share with you. But I still believe in the power of my story, and I'm so honored to be here today to talk to you and to feel as if I have a voice and that people actually want to listen to what I have to say. And our story, the story of undocumented people in America, is really complex. It's diverse. It's multifaceted. It is filled with uncertainty every day, every hour, and every minute. It is a story of closed doors, where a country that was once willing to provide a pathway for undocumented immigrants, where there were laws in place that made it possible for employers to file for you, are now closing those doors. A country that gave us the tools to build our lives here, that gave children, regardless of their immigration status, the opportunity to get an education and raise them to love and respect this country. And yet somewhere down the line, we have decided to close the doors and make it increasingly impossible to be in this country. But despite these closed doors, people have to eat. They have to feed their children, and they have to drive to work every day with the mounting fear that they may be deported. The American story, or the undocumented American story, is also the story of broken dreams. Broken families split up because of deportations, mixed families where parents or siblings are separated from their U.S. citizen family members. It's also a story of depression and stress and fear, and the psychological aspects of being in this country but not having any of the freedoms that so many people enjoy. It's a story of parents feeling that they can no longer provide for their children, and they cannot even visit their children at school, for example, because in order to enter, they can't visit their children at school for like a teacher-parent conference, for example, because in order to enter a public school, you have to show some kind of driver's license or ID. It's those everyday restrictions that really make this life difficult. It's also a story about extraordinary hope and faith. And that shows through the hard work that I have committed as a student, as a member of Hoist for Immigrant Rights. It's the story of Americans who work of undocumented immigrants that work as nannies, that raise American children, that teach in schools, that employ Americans, that pay taxes. They suffer with the hope that one day their children will have more opportunities. And I think for me, if there's one message that I would really like to share and hope that you take away from this, is that this pathway is just about feeling human in this country. And we have lost a lot. Our freedom to be mobile, our freedom to provide for our families, our freedom to just feel like we exist. So my hope is that you listen to my story and really see the human side and the aspects of immigration reform that really come from all of our stories. Thank you.
Thank you seems inadequate, Kim, but thank you for sharing it. I mean, I think the last time a scholar cried from this podium is when a publisher would not extend the deadline on a book that was still late. So we don't see a lot of that here at the Wilson Center. Thank you. Next, last but not least, Citlali. Her family hails from Mexico, and she's our next presenter. Citlali, come on up. Great job. Do you want your water with you?
Oh.
Okay.
Hello, and good afternoon. My name is Citlali, like was said, and I am currently a student at Georgetown studying government. And I obviously was born in Mexico, Monterrey, Mexico. And before I turned 4, my family and I traveled back and forth between the United States and Mexico. But I actually had my first birthday here, and there is still a picture of me sitting on top of a table in Los Angeles with a giant chunk of cake in my mouth. And my parents always joke that even at 1, I was an American. So it's really, this experience for me has been a lot different than Kim's and Francisco's, in the sense that I have known for a while and throughout my life that I was not legally in the country, so to speak, or at least that my status had not been resolved. And so this affected my life greatly. I was raised in an immigrant community in Houston, Texas. So even when I was in elementary school, my peers would joke about being an illegal and would jokingly ask themselves if they or their parents had crossed the border. And once I came home to my mother and actually explained that this had happened to me, and I told her I jokingly revealed that my father had crossed the border, and she was very upset. Because essentially what I did not realize was that I was putting my family at risk by doing this. And so at a very young age, I was probably around 8 or 9, my parents made a point to really internalize silence and internalize the idea that I should never talk about the fact that I was undocumented. At the time, we were trying to really fix our status, our situation, very similarly to what Kim covered in her story. My family also applied for for residency, essentially, through an employer. And because my mother and my father came to this country with a skill set that allowed them to do this. And it wasn't too long before my father was actually granted this opportunity in 2000. And this was actually before our visas expired. So if everything had gone according to plan, so to speak, my parents and I would have status, would be legally in the country. However, this was not the case, and again, very similarly to what Kim spoke of, after the devastating attacks on the World Trade Center in 2001, there was confusion and a lot of misunderstanding within the system, which led to also our application being lost in the process. But we actually did not find this out until 12 years after we actually submitted the application. So we were told to wait for a very long time. And growing up, knowing of my uncertain status, or the fact that I didn't have one in the country, very much shaped the way in which I lived my life. So growing up as a preteen and a teenager, I was very resentful of the fact that my parents had actually brought me here. It was easy to point the finger at my parents and say, or ask, why did you bring me to this country if you knew this was going to happen? Of course, that was not the case, and I am extremely thankful that my parents did, in fact, bring me to this country. I wouldn't be at Georgetown. I wouldn't be here in front of you today. I wouldn't have nearly as many opportunities had they not made that huge sacrifice. But when I did find out that our application had indeed been lost in the process, it was a rough time for me. especially because I had just been accepted to Georgetown my senior year. And it was a great moment, but rough at the same time, because I hoped to go to college knowing that I could perhaps take up an internship or study abroad, many of the things that are normal at Georgetown and even expected of the majority of the students. But of course, again, that wasn't the case. My parents were very encouraging and optimistic, and they said I studied hard and that I dodged all the right bullets, that things were in the works. Luckily, on July 15th of last year, or June 15th rather, of last year, when President Obama did in fact announce deferred action for childhood arrivals, I was in the position to apply and very much excited by the entire provision. But I should reiterate that DACA has only provided a small sense of security for me and children and young adults like me. And I say that because you still encounter that questioning period where even employers will, like Kim reiterated, will ask you or are curious about your status, even though you don't have a status, you have a work permit. So this, of course, is the reason that we're having this conversation. But more importantly, even though Kim Francisco and I are very much attached to the Georgetown experience, we cannot detach ourselves from our friends, our family, and our community members back home, who we see as just as deserving and just as responsible and very much part of the American community. And so this is exactly why we are having this conversation today. We are only some among beautiful, noteworthy stories worthy of attention. But even though I have been at university only for a semester and a half almost, I feel like I've learned a lot. And Kim and Francisco have taught me a lot about what it means to persevere and what it means to be yourself in this situation, which is often very difficult. But that is one of the most important lessons I've learned thus far. And we certainly need to get this conversation rolling. So like I said, as much as we feel attached to the Georgetown experience, there are so many other facets of this issue that we feel attached to. And as a result of my own experiences with the immigration system, we certainly believe, and I certainly believe, that the system's capacity to successfully process all of these applications that would, be in the system if immigration reform was to go through, was signed. We need to assess the system's ability and the system's capacity to actually go through with that. That's certainly something we think about after the piece of legislation gets signed into law, but something we definitely need to consider when we were talking about immigration reform. So I was very glad to hear that President Obama recently released a number of about 140 judges that would be immigration judges that would be utilized especially for this process if this was to be the case. But lately, with all the coverage surrounding immigration reform, suggestions are being thrown around like antiques at an auction, and here we find ourselves committing to these trade-offs. This is one of the most frustrating aspects of this process for me. We see fit that immigrants learn English and that they pay a fine and they file proof of taxes and etc. Such provisions create a gap within the immigrant community itself. And I've had the privilege of discussing some of these issues with people working in communities where they simply believe that the majority of the population is not going to be eligible for a lot of these benefits simply because the application is too expensive or because they may not qualify because people don't know English. So this is certainly an aspect that I feel is very, certainly very important. So immigration enforcement is tricky, and perhaps the trickiest to sort of tackle. But coming from a border state, I believe that security must be approached in a very humane manner. And we believe, certainly as a club and as advocates, that the best way to prevent illegal immigration or the obstruction of the law is not to push people into the hottest parts of the Arizona desert, where they die of dehydration in the process of trying to come to America. And it's certainly not to bar their children from access to education or make people's lives impossible. It's to reform the system from the inside.
Let me just say, whether documented, undocumented, native-born, or visitors from another planet, these are three remarkable young people, amazing poise, wouldn't you say? That was quite impressive. I'm going to indulge myself with a couple questions, and then we're going to come to you for your questions and comments. And you all touched on it, and see, Lala, you made the point that your experience and learning about your status was different than Francisco's or Kim's. But I'm going to ask each of you in the order that you spoke, once again, to revisit that, and specifically to talk about when was the first time you had a realization that your status, so to speak, was a challenge or a problem or something you were going to have to deal with?
I mean, I try to be consistent with my story, and I normally say that I first learned about my status when I was a sophomore in high school. The reality is that I probably learned about my status when I was in the 8th grade. At that point, it was kind of unimportant or insignificant in the sense that it didn't really matter, or I didn't fully understand what it meant to be here legally. It did matter, however, that sophomore year, simply because I was pursuing a summer school program, and I came across the application where I came also across the box where I was supposed to fill out my social security number, and I very innocently asked my mother what that number was, and she said, well, you don't have one. And I innocently asked, well, how can I get that number? And she basically told me that we were living here legally, and that's really when I was first exposed to the realities and really the obstacles that I would have to overcome to be where I am now. And it was a very, very harsh time in my life. I mean, I had dreams of attending Harvard, Princeton, Columbia, and at that time when I first learned about my status, it was almost a stab at the heart, and it clearly shattered my dreams, and I had no role model, and I didn't know what to do. But luckily, I did have a support system at school, and we were able to figure out what my options were and really pursue those options. So that's how kind of it all started.
So Kim, how about you?
I found out about my status when I was in high school, but I can't say that I really understood what it meant at that time. I was still kind of in that K through 12 safety bubble, and I had my parents, there with me, and I think it wasn't until I came to Georgetown when I was separated from my family that it became very real. And I think that all of us would agree that we're very close to our families, because oftentimes they're the only people who know about our status and are in the same situation. And so when I came to Georgetown, I was very afraid to talk about my status. I also wasn't very familiar with my community, and I didn't want people to judge me based on my status. I didn't feel, empowered to sit here the way I am now. So no one knew about my status. And slowly, I started to build this network, and I started to inform professors, and I told my roommate. But I think that was when it became most real, when I realized, or when I felt that I was truly alone in my status.
Like I mentioned, I, from a very early age, was encouraged not to talk about my status. So even when I was younger, probably, like I said, around 8 or 9 years old, I knew, and I grew up with it. So it was a very salient part of who I was, and it still continues to be, and I'm pretty sure it's going to continue to be.
What is your experience when you tell friends for the first time?
Well, actually, friends from back home, I gave the speech for the graduating class of 2012 from my high school. I think one person knew about my status. I didn't tell my friends. Some of my best friends were very, very much against any sort of illegal immigration.
And they were vocal about that to you, not knowing what your status was.
Right. Actually, I had a friend when I was younger. It was like sophomore year of high school, and when we actually heard about SB 1070 in Arizona, came up to me, one of my best friends, and she asked me, "Have you heard about what's happening in Arizona?" And I said, "Yes, isn't that terrible?" She said, "Why aren't we doing that here?" And it was devastating, certainly it was. But at the same time, I certainly didn't tell people. It was something that, like I said, it was very much internalized, and I just never talked about it.
Kim, what about you? Is this something you feel compelled to share with people, or compelled to hide, or what? And what happens when you do share?
Well, I think it's kind of changed over time. When I first came to Georgetown, I never imagined that I would be sharing my status with so many people, just because I've been told by so many people in my community that I shouldn't share my status, not just because I'm undocumented, but because I'm not Latino. And I guess their perception was that, there's no one fighting for you, there's no one that looks like you that's standing up there and talking about their status. Like, if you talk about it, like, you're on your own, kind of thing. So I definitely received that kind of pressure from my community. But
So explicitly people have reacted, wait a second, you're not Latino, how can you be?
Yeah, people have done that, but how? Like, well, I mean, what does an undocumented immigrant look like? We come from all over the world. And so, yeah, people are definitely shocked. And I was talking about this earlier, and I think that in a way, not seeming like what the stereotypical undocumented immigrant is like has been kind of a blessing and a burden, because when I did travel and I would go by plane to go back home, I was never asked anything, about, because my last name is not, a Latino last name. People never wondered, why I didn't have this visa or what have you. I was just kind of passed through. But at the same time, it was difficult because I didn't have like that support network and community that I felt like a lot of my Latino peers had. I didn't have a role model. I didn't have, someone with an African name or an African heritage talking about their status.
No.
But I think anytime you're trying, there's like no kind of right way,
manual,
right way to reveal your status. It's always kind of awkward, and it always involves, depending on who you're telling, it involves a lot of tears, and it involves a lot of like going back and forth with your story and trying to, help people understand how you got to this point.
Yeah.
It's difficult.
Francisco, what about you in sharing with friends?
Well, coming from New York City, it wasn't very difficult to talk about the issues, simply because it's a very diverse community. Where I grew up, the predominantly three large Hispanic groups were Mexicans, Dominicans, and Puerto Ricans. Of course, Puerto Ricans have a different story, but there were a lot of Dominicans and Mexicans who were not here with legal status. And so it was never really an issue until I came here. And I think we all agree that we became really good liars, and really good bad liars, in the sense that we would always make up different stories. So one day I would be a permanent resident, and then the other day I would be a dual citizen, and then the other day I would be waiting to hear back for my citizenship. So it was off. But these were the lies that we were almost forced to kind of share with our peers and classmates, simply because we weren't ready to reveal our true identity. And so, of course, we all share that universal feeling of, hey, I want to go abroad, but clearly that's not an option. Hey, I want to look for an internship that's a paid internship. And so, in fact, I had a lot of friends who would always ridicule those who would work for free. They would say, oh, I would never work for free. Like, those people are idiots for, providing their services in exchange for no like monetary value. But here I was, after 7 unpaid internships, obviously getting no monetary value, as they would say. So it was very hard to relate, and it was very hard to sometimes even share with them my actual status.
Beyond public speaking and the anxiety that comes with that, I'm guessing that today sharing your stories in such a public manner may be bringing out some primal anxieties from your childhood. How are you feeling about this now? Was that an Oprah question or a If you were a tree, Francisco, what kind of tree? But are you now comfortable about this? Are you feeling good about the opportunity to share?
I personally,
I see some mixed feelings in your face, Sitali.
I feel a lot more comfortable sharing my story now. And one of my mentors from back home, actually, when I told her that I was doing this event, she was overwhelmed because she knew sort of the process that I had gone through to get to college and how much it had affected me to always be separated from everyone else when applying to scholarships or applying to schools, because certain schools wouldn't accept me, because certain schools wouldn't provide financial aid, etc. I'm personally a lot more comfortable with talking about it now. Would I go back and talk about it with that's what I'm most afraid of. Sharing it in a public setting like this is not so much the problem, but if you put me in front of, like my friend that I just mentioned, that would be a lot more difficult.
I completely get that. It's easier to do it in a more diffuse manner. What's the most difficult situation you've faced, Kim? Or maybe that's too dramatic. Is it more of an ongoing sort of, awareness of that you're dealing with something that is unresolved?
Right. And there's one aspect that I feel like is not emphasized enough. And I think that like the psychological toll that it takes. And I think, I don't know, just getting phone calls from your parents and just realizing that like you're in this bubble, and I feel like Georgetown is, definitely a wonderful university, but my parents are still struggling a lot, and that's, sorry.
No, of course. Don't apologize,
takes a
please.
lot psychologically.
I'm just grabbing some reinforcements here for you. Here we go.
You don't have like so many.
No, it's okay.
But that takes a lot, just kind of that added burden, just as a student, as a young person, to also be thinking about, the fact that like I'm so lucky, and I really don't know. I did work hard in school, but I really don't know what I've done to be at this moment. And I wish that that my parents could also have the same security and feel empowered the way I do.
Well, let's hope they can someday soon. What about you? What's the?
Making me cry. This is not good. I'm so sorry.
I would cry, but I don't want my makeup to run. So no. What's the most difficult situation you've ever encountered?
I really think I do share that same experience.
Worried about your parents?
With my parents, just the fact that they're not here to, treasure everything I'm doing. In fact, like I mentioned before,
you mentioned the graduation.
The fact that they live in constant fear, the fact that they're afraid of just getting out of a car and going anywhere. It's frustrating, and the psychological effects of our stories, imagine the psychological effects on our parents, and this is something they don't talk about just because they don't have the time to sit down and think about this. And it's so unfair to them, and it's so unfair when we start blaming them for bringing us here. It's a really unfair system, and it's unfair that we have to go through this. It's almost like we're carrying extra luggage or extra baggage on our shoulders, and it's just not what we chose to do or what our parents chose for us either. Right. So yeah, I think definitely like just thinking about our parents is very difficult.
Well, look, there's no way to make such a difficult situation sound easy, but I can say with great certainty as a parent myself that I know your achievements and what you're doing must bring them great comfort. As tough as it is, I'm sure they're very proud of you. Toughest situation that you've faced, other than right now?
Oh, goodness. I can definitely remember the toughest situation. It was at actually a summer camp at a university. And they were taking a trip to NASA.
How old were you?
I was a sophomore in high school.
High school, okay.
So I think I was 16. Right. I was at the summer camp, and this is an instance, I guess, so different from a more general answer. But this is when I remember most just being extremely upset. And it definitely had a lot to do with the fact that I was put on the spot almost. I knew it was coming because we were going to NASA, and we had to go through background checks, like all of the participants. Obviously, I couldn't go through a background check. So they brought me into this room, and it was all of the residential assistants plus the program director, very prestigious program. And so they sat me down and they asked me, they said, we need proof of citizenship to go through this. And my answer was just, I don't have any. So they were confused at first, and they're like, anything? I mean, you don't have any, like, not a birth certificate or a license? No, I don't have anything. Like, I'm telling you right now, I don't have anything. And it was odd and very strange because obviously I had gotten into the program with the help of an advisor that knew the people that ran the program. And so it was the fact that I was singled out, and then I had to go back to all of the rest of the participants in the program and pretend like I had just forgot to submit a paper. And that's the reason why I wasn't going on the field trip.
Kim, final word.
Yeah, I'm not from Mexico, but
We've established that. Okay.
Do you feel like?
But no, I and it's difficult to explain, but I think I realized that probably in no other country in the world could I be sitting here as an undocumented young person telling you what I want in immigration reform, why I deserve to be in this country. I couldn't do that anywhere else. Like, I don't think that my story could be possible anywhere else, and that's what's so powerful about this country, that we can be having these discussions. Like, you can't do that anywhere else. And so that's why I relate so strongly to being an American, and I can't fully describe it, and I don't know why I get emotional about it, but I just know that I wouldn't be Kimberly if I wasn't in America. I wouldn't be who I am, so.
Well, if there's ever been a finer closing statement, I don't know. We're not going to step on that one. We know when to bail. Thank you for your attendance, and before we leave, please join me in thanking this remarkable panel. Thank you. Thanks for joining us.